Welcome, Hillary.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be with you.
I am so delighted to have you. When I finished reading your book, I think I contacted you pretty much as soon as I was done because I really, really, really liked your book.
Mm.
And then there was just all this sort of back and forth with scheduling and stuff, but I am just so delighted that we now have a chance to talk. And
Mm.
I was just telling you before the episode how I wish this kind of a book was available for me back then, but I'm so happy that it is now available for people to pick up and help them understand their body and trauma and how it impacts. And let's get into it.
Yes, I can't wait. I can't wait. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just some of the things that really stuck out to me with your book. And by the way, the book, for those of you, I will link the book in the show notes, but it's called The Wisdom of Your Body. And from the very first chapter, I think it was about being fully alive and exploring and understanding embodiment. And right away, I was like, oh, yes. You go right into
Mm.
explaining how this just kind of this process of disembodiment starts to happen to us and how we become disembodied. And of course, those of us who have experienced trauma can certainly relate to that. And then trying to figure out how to come back into our bodies.
Hmm.
So I thought we could talk a bit about maybe you could help us understand fully alive and exploring embodiment and what
Sure.
happens. Yeah.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start by defining the terms a little bit because I think that the word embodiment gets used a lot colloquially, but as an academic, as someone whose scholarship is focused on this area, often the way that I'm using it differs a little bit from how we're talking about it culturally. When we talk about embodiment culturally, we often mean that somebody is fleshing out their values in a sense, which is not wrong. Like that it definitely is one way of thinking about the term. Somebody has a value of compassion and then they do compassion. You go, wow, that caregivers really embodying their value. They're really living out the thing that matters to them.
Mhm.
And when I talk about embodiment, what I'm talking about is this field of scholarship that is really cross-disciplinary, emerging out of philosophy and existentialism and phenomenology, and bridging into psychology and what it means to experience ourselves fully. And how do we disconnect from ourselves as bodies? And then how do we return to a more sensory, attuned, connected relationship with ourselves? So the definition of embodiment that I find really useful and helpful is kind of my hybrid of a few different scholars, particularly Merleau-Ponty and Eva Peron, Christine Caldwell, this idea that we are bodies. An embodiment is the experience of being a body, not just being a mind that has a body that carries it around, but that this experience of being a body is shaped by our social worlds. That in our Western context, in our white context, when I think about all of these different narratives around dominant culture, the contextual narrative is that we are an individual and our body is proof that we are disconnected from each other. And yet actually our bodies don't necessarily even say that. Our bodies are enculturated, our bodies are relational, our bodies
Mhm.
hold ancestry and tell stories and are constantly telling what's happened in the past and are shaping what happens in the
Mhm.
future. And even when we look, I mean, when we get into the science of the neuroscience of this, I find it fascinating in embodied cognition and bodily neuroscience processes. We see that often the motor neurons responsible for action get activated before the sequences in our mind associated with choice are activated. It's almost like our bodies are making choices for us before our minds even know why at times. And that's confusing to us as people who really want to be minds. And so we make up a story that goes along with what our body is doing. But we are actually way more body than people think. And our bodies are actually way more relational than we think. So embodiment is this field of an interdisciplinary kind of approach to personhood that looks at reclaiming the body as the central place where our humanness exists and looks at helping us be in a positive relationship with the qualities of our body, including sensation and longing and emotion and expression and movement and aging and time and all the things that go along with that. To be disembodied, in contrast, is this kind of separation within the self. It might be as simple as thinking we are more of a mind than we are a body, but it can go all the way to clinical lengths and what we might describe clinically as dissociation or kind of these depersonalization, derealization disorders. But the inability to attune to our bodily selves, to experience ourselves as a body, and then to be in a harmonious relationship with our bodily selves. And my work, so much of it focuses on helping us both understand what embodiment is and what disembodiment is. But I think really beyond that, helping us return to embodied states. And I say return primarily because I don't think it's something we have to learn. I think it's something that's naturally wired into us as people, and we just need to remember it.
Mhm. That's really a beautiful and hopeful idea that we have to remember, because
Mm,
it could feel so overwhelming
yes,
when it can feel like it's not natural, but you're saying we just need to remember it and that it is natural.
right.
There's so much in what you said that was just incredible, and I, I just loved it, talking about just the way our bodies have been, designed to protect us, and how some of the actions that we do happen before we even realize. I was just thinking about, you're crossing a street and then you don't realize, but your body realizes that,
Right.
oh, there's a car coming, and
Right.
and then you're like, what just happened? But your body jumped out of the way.
Hmm.
It's sort of that kind of thing. And I just think that what that starting to see that and the magnificence of that is really like, I don't know, it kind of it's because it's so uh we're so not used to that. When you do start to think about it, it's very humbling.
Mm,
So yeah, and when you talked also about that this is something that happens culturally. And even, when you were discussing connection, I think you said connection, but you were talking about how we naturally, our bodies want to connect. Like this is, I think you said that, unless I read it in your book, but
uh-huh.
that we have this wanting to connect, and yet we just get these messages that either, our bodies are not, they need to be tamed, or they're not good, or they're dangerous.
Hmm.
And yeah, we seem to learn that really, really young.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to realize
Hmm.
just how young it starts. And I think many of us might have some familiarity with that around adolescence, like maybe when our sexuality is emerging in a more obvious way and we are told, that's going to get you into trouble, or we take more risks, or we're more expressive in a certain way, and the people around us say, don't, that's not good for you, don't do that. But actually, when we look at what happens in terms of us starting to mistrust our body and the messages around that, it happens much, much younger than that. It happens even before the childhood stories that maybe we could reach for if we were really scraping the bottom of the barrel. And we realized, wow, that's kind of strange that we were told to sit still all the time in school, when actually our bodies at that age wanted to run and play and jump and dance. And it is kind of strange that I had to ask permission to go to the bathroom, and that sometimes I had to wait longer than I wanted
Mm.
to, and I couldn't honor my body's cues. But even further back into our story, when we experience fear or we experience sadness as an infant, and we have a caregiver say to us, "You're okay. You're okay." Right? Dismissing and denying and invalidating the lived reality of our experience. And I understand as a parent why parents do that. What we want to say is, "Oh, honey, You're safe. Your
Mm,
body is safe. Even though you're scared, I want you to know you're safe. You're not in danger. It's okay. But what we say instead is how you're feeling is not how you're feeling.
mhm,
And that gives an infant, really one of two choices. I either don't believe myself or I don't believe my caregiver. And when we are wired to our caregivers for our survival, we will choose connection and belonging with them over ourselves every time. So I think these experiences of I'm hungry, no, you're not, right? I'm sad, no, you're not. Or even, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, when we have a felt sense in our bodies of how our caregivers are distressed, right? If you could imagine, I've got a little daughter, she's an infant, and if I'm, I was choking on something the other day, just the water went down the wrong tube, sort of thing, and
mm,
she looked at me and she was scared because she could see that I was making a noise that I don't normally make. There is something that we do as parents where we go, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And
yeah.
I think what happens because our bodies, again, are wired to be in relationship with each other, we sense if someone we love isn't okay. And when they invalidate that sense, again, it makes us ask, mm, is it me that's wrong or is it them? And I think the
Mm,
consequences to answering that, no matter how we do, are pretty profound.
wow. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the kind of parenting that we had, that
Mm,
we learned rather, not that we had,
sure, sure,
when my kids were younger, was if they were, I don't know, doing something you didn't want them to do, you would, and this was very popular, time out.
sure.
Put them on the stairs and let them sit there and think about it.
Yeah.
I when I think about this now, I mean, I've apologized to my kids a million times, and I
Mm,
said I would never do this. I mean,
right.
it's just absolutely, it makes no sense.
Mm,
Because basically they're feeling something instead of allowing them to feel what they feel and comfort them, let them know that it's okay. You're punishing them and you're telling them to think about it. Their cognitive thinking is not even online yet.
right,
They're too
right,
young.
right.
It's just like, yeah. So I mean, yeah, I can just so see that.
But I
Wow.
think it's, people might be listening to this and saying, well, okay, well, why you're talking about feeling in infants? This is a conversation about embodiment. And perhaps the listeners of your show might not think that because they might be a little bit more aware of where I'm going with this. But I think the average person might still be kind of confused. Like, what do feelings have to do with the body? And forget that feelings and affect is a bodily process. It is sensation wired with action potential, wired with, resourcing and drive and impulse and like fast and slow twitch muscle fibers and sensory motor cortex activation and interoceptive sensing. Like feeling is a bodily process. It's not just the name that we give to it. And I think until we understand how much feeling is in our body, we won't quite understand why it is so hard for us to be in our bodies. And I
Mhm.
think that comes back to, for many of us, that we weren't allowed to feel, and that feelings, the message around them was that they're dangerous. They need to go away. They
Mhm.
need to be numbed, avoided, shamed. And like you said, they take us away from the people that we love.
Mhm. Yeah. And they need to be controlled. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing. So I'm just thinking about that swallowing all of those feelings, and I'm glad you really brought the attention to so much younger, because I think,
Mm.
I don't know if we would naturally think that it starts that young, but it does. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Mm.
Like I remember it's first of all, it's fascinating to have been a psychologist and spent all of these years in graduate school learning all sorts of things about developmental psychology, and then to become a parent after that and to go, oh my goodness, the textbooks were right. And like,
Mm.
wow, look what I'm seeing.
Mhm.
But my daughter, I think it really hits home for me when I think about those really early days of her brand new and not able to in any way articulate verbally or with any kind of nuance how she's feeling, and me noticing my reactions to that. Like if that was like day one, her crying, hungry, tired, whatever it was, diaper change, the things that kids need when they're young. And me first realizing, my compassion. And then, if there were moments where she wouldn't stop crying, like, okay, now my panic and now my frustration, or now whatever it was that was coming up, and realizing, oh, that's interesting that like day 1, day 5, day 10, 3 months in, a year in, I could already be having messages sent to her through my face, through my tone of voice, like, this is too much for me. This needs to go away. And that's all before we remember any of it. Like,
Wow.
that's all shaping how we feel about ourselves in this kind of intrapsychic, internalized, neurobiological way. So I think there's an argument here to think about embodiment as an attachment process, and something that we can preserve when we know that our bodily experiences won't be too much for our caregivers. And when we know that our body, not just appearance, right? Because that's a thing that people often think I'm talking about when I say, you
Yes.
are your body. They're like, no, please don't. I don't want to be how I look. I'm like, well, how you look is just one part of your body. It just happens to be the outside part, but it's actually not even the most important part. It's just one of the parts. But if we can be accepted fully in our bodies by our caregivers, I think we don't have to leave our experiences to try to belong. I don't think we have to disconnect from our body to stay safe relationally.
Yeah. Well, that's going to bring me now into what about those who now we're going to move into traumatic experiences
Yeah.
where they're feeling that overwhelming, surge of energy that can feel really frightening, where they have that
Mm-hmm.
adrenaline, they want to jump out, through the wall, through the window,
Mm-hmm.
and can't, they're stuck.
Mm-hmm.
What about that? Can we talk about how does that impact one's ability to start to feel like to start to basically become disembodied? Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Well, it brings to mind the bimodal nature of the trauma response, in that there are activation responses to trauma, but when the activation responses don't get us anywhere, it takes us into the deactivation responses, the dissociation, the hypoarousal, the shutdown, kind of vasovagal responses. And so I think what's important to recognize that our body is very intuitive and very wise in terms of how our system is making choices about what will keep us alive, what will keep us safe. And there is something about the activation response that is a lot. Like, it takes a lot of energy. It is scary. It comes because we're afraid, and usually we can learn to be afraid of it itself. And our systems naturally know when being with that for too long and too much in an unsupported way isn't going to change anything, and intuitively knows how to shut down. So while I talk about disembodiment as a kind of fragmented way of being, and yes, that's true, I think spiritually, existentially, psychologically, physiologically, I also have a deep appreciation for when our bodies do that as a means of getting away from what is otherwise
Mhm,
overwhelming, because those states are truly really hard to be with. We're not meant to
mhm,
live in them. They're meant to be,
mhm,
an arc, a waveform of something that emerges, helps us change a situation or get away. And when it doesn't, when we're stuck, what do we have left to do except shut down and disconnect? My own experience of trauma and a PTSD diagnosis, and the experience of navigating recovery, was such that I understand what it is like, both to know what is happening in my body and also to wish that it wasn't. Also to feel the terror and the horror of this overwhelming nervous system response, and see that as proof, even if in moments or over periods of time, like, that's proof that my body is bad, isn't it? Right? Because if my body was good, it wouldn't hurt so much. It wouldn't be so
mhm,
scary. It wouldn't be having these panic attacks for no
mhm,
reason, air
mhm,
quote, no reason. And it's been really helpful for me in my trauma recovery journey to be able to see the goodness of the activation as well as the goodness of the shutdown. Right? To see the trustworthiness of the dissociation, and to see the trustworthiness of the fight or flight response, of the the action tendency that's latent in my muscles. And for me, the story that I often return to myself when those moments happen now, and again, I've done enough processing that I'm able to have this narrative at the same time as the response is happening, which isn't always the case when we're early on in our processing work. I can feel my heart racing and the panic emerging. And I can also say to my system, oh, honey, you think we're back there. You think we're back there and you think it's happening again. And I want you to know, sweetie, we're not. We're right here. And here's the proof. I'm right at my desk in my home where I live now. This is the year that it is. This is the season it is. This is what's happening in my life. We're not stuck back there. You're safe. We're here together.
It's
And
so,
I'm going to
so,
protect you.
so beautiful, Hillary.
Thank you.
Oh,
But it's like that allows me to be in relationship
yeah.
with the panic
Mm-hmm.
in a
Mm-hmm.
way that doesn't demean or shame or blame it, and also holds its wisdom. Like that response was exactly what I needed when I was in the trauma. And
Yeah.
because I couldn't get away, it got
Yeah.
locked in my body. And my body, on some level, doesn't think that it's over because it didn't get to complete the thing it needed to complete. And so just being able to recognize, like, oh, that is good. That
Mm.
is good. It's a little mismatched with the timing, right? I'll give my system that. Like, yeah, this is a little mismatched. That made a lot of sense in 2009. It made a lot of sense
Mm-hmm.
in you know
Mm-hmm.
2015 and whatever. But I love being able to see that both can be true. That the activation can be horrifying to sense, and it can be good, and I can be good as it's all happening. And the same with dissociation. That numbness of, like, I don't have a body, I understand why it's happening and I can love it in a way because I don't think that it is bad. I think it is my system doing exactly what my system knows how to do when things are overwhelming. And the irony is that, and we know this from the social response model of trauma, that when we have our experiences known and validated and cared for and witnessed and seen,
Mm-hmm.
that it provides one of the experiences of relational
Yeah.
safety, which signals to our nervous system it's over. So the irony is, like, as the trauma response is coming up, when we meet it with compassion, it is the proof that we're through it, and the response tends to settle.
Oh, so beautiful. Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm shaking my head.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, that is the response that we needed back then.
Mhm,
And when you meet yourself, when you have that, the way you were describing it each time, it is that it's that completion. You're now doing it and providing that inner relationship, and it's
mhm.
just really beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's a process.
Of course, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
On that note, when I think about the process, I'm just grateful for the number of people in my life who could hold that truth for me before
Mm,
I could for myself,
mm,
and how useful it is to have people, even people we're not in close relationship with, people who we're just, listening to their podcast or we're reading their book or whatever. Like, okay, that's a possibility of what I need to hear. And I'm going to imagine that they're saying that to me in that moment. And then maybe when I do that enough, I can imagine me saying it to me. Like, I think
mm,
we can borrow narratives from each other. And actually, I wouldn't say I think I can. I think we can. I'd say that is actually how our inner narratives develop. When we think about our mental landscape, our inner thought life, it is usually the result of those early relational experiences that we've had. And when we have new relational experiences that are corrective, including ones that we are observing and borrowing from, I
mm,
believe that our system wants to adopt something healthier. Even if
mhm.
it's hard, our system wants to know how to love itself.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that you know, some of the language around that can also be called disconfirming experiences, whether that's
Yes.
with a friend or a therapist or um, a group, but just having that experience of being like unconditionally welcomed and accepted
Hmm.
is so healing. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, and on repeat, you know, is
Exactly.
yeah, really
Yeah.
beautiful. And of course, directing it towards ourself. I know when people are at the beginning of their healing journey, that's often like when you talk about having self-compassion, it can feel like, oh, like no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but in time, it can start to develop.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you're right.
Mm. So, we talked a little bit about, how we kind of start to leave our body and become disembodied, and even how we can start to become
Hmm.
uh, embodied. Can you talk more about that? How we can start to help our bodies to get comfortable being inside, for example, when we do feel a lot of sensation?
Yeah. I think that there's something about realizing it could be as simple as being right here, right now, right? I've got training in all sorts of different somatic
Mhm,
modalities and all sorts of different kinds of trauma therapies. And the reality is that those can feel onerous and hard to access and maybe, you know, too skill based, too laborious in a way. What I always like to let people know is that, when you're uncomfortable in your chair and you shift your posture to be more comfortable, you're doing it. When you are thirsty and you go get a glass of water,
mhm,
you're doing it.
mhm,
When you're tired and you put yourself to bed, you're doing it,
mhm,
right? I think in the embodiment space, there's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of practices that feel like really expressive and have to do with unstructured movement. And those are regular practices in my day to day that have saved my life. I'm sure of it. And also, like when we're looking at the recovery journey, often where we start is exactly where we are, and just making these tiny little tweaks in trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga. They talk about this as effective action. The idea that, like, oh, if something feels off, I can do something about it, or choice, right? Um, if I'm noticing what's happening inside of my system, I can respond. And when we do that, when we have an impulse in a bodily way, when we have a longing or a felt sense of a need, and we take goal directed action towards meeting that need, there's a dopamine secretion that's, I think, connected to the learning process and the good feelings associated with building self-trust. So the research, I mean, Christine Caldwell's work has talked about this a little bit too, but there is something about noticing we have a need and meeting it on a small, almost invisible day-to-day level that builds the quality of self-trust as an embodied process. And it doesn't have to be fancy. There doesn't have to be anyone around. It doesn't have to look like processing your hardest trauma. It can simply be, I'm hungry, so I fed
mhm,
myself.
mhm.
I was full, so I stopped.
No, what you're saying is 100% accurate. I remember working with someone, and that is exact. She came from, yeah, where she wasn't able to feel anything growing up. She couldn't
Hmm.
because there was too much going on with
Yeah.
anyway. So her process was that she never, if she felt hungry or thirsty, she wouldn't even notice. It would be
Yeah.
hours. She had to go use the washroom. She didn't even, and that
Yeah.
she was starting to get into contact with when she was thirsty.
Mm,
And, and that was exactly what you're saying. Just the beginning of self care, the beginning of meeting her own needs. It was amazing.
mm.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's
It's
big.
it's such a big deal, right?
It
It
is.
seems small, but it's not. These are
Mm-mm.
profound changes when our bodily realities have been ignored and denied, and we've learned to ignore and deny them as a tool for our relational survival. So I think I don't want to dismiss these interventions as being insignificant. They're profound. And I think that they are the bedrock of our ability to feel like an adult, to
Yeah.
feel safe in our bodies, to believe that we're worthy of care.
Oh, absolutely, and, that's why when she started doing that, I remember feeling I just felt very emotional because that was it. I was witnessing her for the first time taking care of herself, and it was just
Mm,
absolutely amazing. And also, I remember, at the same time, she was not used to expressing herself, and she had wanted to express herself, things that were bothering her in her relationship, but she just couldn't let it out. So I suggested she maybe write it down. So she wrote it down on a paper bag and handed it to her partner.
Mm.
And when he had no issue with it and he did what it said on the paper, she was blown away. But that little tiny step gave her the confidence to then take the next step, which was maybe to
Right.
voice it. So,
Right. Wow.
yeah. So you can't minimize anything.
Hmm.
They're all so important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many other things I'd like to say. I just said minimize, and I was thinking about how we, part of also our healing journey and embodiment is learning not to minimize the physical sensations that we are feeling, like we were saying, hungry, thirsty, but
Right.
also maybe I'm tired. Maybe I
Mm.
don't want to go to this party. Maybe I don't want to go. Maybe I want to say no. And starting to learn how not to bypass those impulses.
Yes.
Mm,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's something that comes to mind whenever we're talking about paying attention, and that is making a bit of space. Like, it's really hard to notice the impulses when we're jam packed, when our attention is saturated with all the things we have to do and the places we have to go and the stimulus that we have around us, our devices, our social media. Like, just having moments, like maybe noticing is too hard, but maybe there's an opportunity for you to create just a little bit of space. And within that blank space that's unscheduled, unsaturated, that then you might encounter a little bit of sensation, a little bit of noticing, a little bit of wanting, a little bit of feeling. And it might be those places that your journey to feel into yourself begins, not
Mm,
by expecting that you'll notice and be attuned to any kind of sensation or emotion or impulse right away, but simply by leaving the space for them to appear. And I
mm,
imagine that as being a way that we say to our bodily self, I want to hear you, and I'm going to make space to listen to you. And when you're ready to talk, I'll listen, and I'll be
mm,
here listening. And you take as long as you need to talk to me.
mm. I love that. And
Mm.
I just love the compassion, because when you were talking at the beginning about the, did you use the word malev I think that we sort of have this feeling because it's giving us panic, because it's feeling
Mm.
that it has a bad intention. And the way you're talking is out of friendship and out of love and out of compassion. And there's a welcoming that I think our bodies may have never experienced before, and I think have always yearned to feel that.
Yes, I am
Yeah,
so with you. I think that's what we
yeah,
yearn for on a deep
mm,
level.
yeah. Mm. Wow. Is there anything else you want to bring to this conversation?
I mean, not without taking a whole other hour.
I know.
There's so much that we could say, but I
I
feel like
know.
this is a lovely place
Okay.
to leave it. Like, we've talked about
Okay.
the
Mm,
problems and some
mm,
strategies, and
mm,
yeah, I'm just
okay.
grateful to have shared little tidbits with your community, and
Mm.
I feel fine leaving it here. I mean, this is a great place to say, if you want to read more, you can check out the
Mhm.
book.
Yes, yes. And I also I love audiobooks, so I like listening to it on audio
Mm,
if you guys like that. It's really, really good. And I appreciate you. I thank you for the work that you're doing and that you're putting out
mm.
there. It's making a huge difference. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm so grateful. Thank you for having me. Thanks to you for each of you for listening, for making space for this to hear my voice. And I hope that you get to make space to hear your own voice, your bodily voice too.